Joining us now, NBC senior national politics reporter John Allen and Matthew Dowd, chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney 2004 campaign and a senior MSNBC political contributor. So, John, how unexpected are these results for the Trump campaign, and are they a warning for him?
They've gotten used to a zombie candidate, that being Nikki Haley, someone who's no longer actually running, taking a substantial share of the votes. But still, what you're seeing in Indiana is a large number, 22%. They certainly didn't want to see that. Obviously, there's no active campaign going on. We've seen Joe Biden not get 100% or close to it in some of the states that have had primaries on the Democratic side since he wrapped up the nomination, which is basically when he announced for renomination. But the 22% number that you're seeing for Haley is not a welcome sign in Trump world.
So, Matthew, hours before those results were called in Indiana, Trump claimed he wasn't concerned about winning over Haley voters. I want to play that.
All of those people are going to come to me because first of all, what's their choice? Biden, he's the worst president in the history of our country.
They're all going to come to me. Is there anything, Matthew, to suggest Trump should be confident that Haley voters are going to come to him?
I think there's a lot of evidence that he's actually right in this circumstance. I mean, I think there's Haley voters that came, the independents in some states and Democrats in some states that came in to vote against Donald Trump. He can't get those. But Haley Republicans, I mean, keep in mind, Donald Trump got 94% of the Republican vote in 2020. After all the Republicans who came out after Hillary Clinton, if the race in 2016 came out and say Donald Trump is awful, he's horrible, Donald Trump actually did better among Republicans against Biden in 2020 than he did in 2016. And every single poll seems to suggest today that he's going to get 92 or 93% of Republicans along the lines of what he did in 2016 and 2020. I equate it to this, and what is happening to this is like a rivalry. So think about like the New York Yankees and the people in New York who love New York, who want the New York Yankees, but are dissatisfied with the coach or dissatisfied with the team, and they play the Cleveland Indians, not to pick a team
the
you're
Guardians.
familiar with. The Guardians. I mean, sorry,
My
the
Guardians, who I prefer to think about much more than the Yankees, but continue.
Yeah, and go Tigers today when they play the Guardians, because my Tigers. So when the Yankees play the Guardians, there's a certain amount of people that say, yeah, fine, I hate our coach right now, but let the Guardians win. But when the Yankees play the Red Sox, any of those people that thought, yeah, it would be okay if the Guardians won, they don't want the Red Sox to win. And that's the same way with these Republican voters in Indiana and other states that are expressing dissatisfaction with Donald Trump. But when they play the political version of the Red Sox being Joe Biden, they're going to come home.
So do you think, John, and I know you've talked to a lot of them, do you think Democrats are overestimating what they're seeing in some of these states with the ongoing Haley vote? And again, first time that it's hit above 20%. And they think that a significant portion, and by significant, could be just a couple of percent, right? Because that could swing an election, that a number of them will either vote for Joe Biden or stay home, which, if they voted for Trump 4 years ago, that's essentially a vote for Joe Biden.
Yeah, some of the Democrats are absolutely overestimating the effect that's going on in terms of, how many of these voters will go away from Trump or didn't in the last election, right, who voted for Trump in the last election and will, go to Joe Biden this time. That is right. The vast majority of Republican voters will end up with Donald Trump. And then there are some Democrats who are not overestimating the impact of this, but rather seeing it as an opportunity to score some political points. It's a big number that they'd like to point to as a sign of Donald Trump's weakness. And at the same time, if you're Trump, you would prefer to see, races where you're losing 10% than losing 20%.
So, Matthew, while Donald Trump is at Mar-a-Lago talking to folks, President Biden is hitting 2 states today. This event just wrapped up. He's hitting battleground Wisconsin among them. Last Wednesday, Vice President Harris was in Florida when its new abortion ban went into effect. Does it make sense for the Biden campaign essentially to fill a coverage hole on Wednesdays when Trump isn't in court?
I mean, absolutely. You would think Donald Trump, who constantly complains that he's not able to campaign, but then he subsequently almost always goes back to Mar-a-Lago to chill with his rich friends or whatever, or he goes golfing. I mean, Donald Trump, if he wasn't in court, I don't think would be on the trail in Iowa or Wisconsin like Biden is, or Michigan. He does what he is comfortable with, which is go back to the safe confines of Mar-a-Lago. So, yeah, I think it's really smart of the Biden campaign to go to the key 6 or 7 states that are going to affect this election in the course of this. And one thing, going to our previous conversation, one thing I think the Democrats should be thinking more about is not about what Republicans are going to come and vote for him, but what Democrats aren't motivated right now. Because as of right now, the Republican Party voters are more motivated, slightly more motivated than Democrats. And so his travel to places like Wisconsin, hopefully in their mind, will change that dynamic and motivate Democrats, because that's the bigger concern, is motivation of Democrats.